VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And welcome to Crosstalk here on VCY America. Do you remember the words of Barney Frank when he said, 2 down, 2 to go? Well, he was referring to the 2 victories that they had, first of all in passing hate crimes legislation, secondly in seeing the repeal of what we knew as Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And what were the 2 things to go? Well, Enda, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and a repeal of DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act. Well, today in the United States Senate Committee, Enda was up for discussion and testimony, and we're going to be getting to that in just a moment with our guest, Matt Staver, founder and president of Liberty Counsel, an international nonprofit litigation, education, and policy organization dedicated to advancing religious freedom, the sanctity of life, and the family. Matt, welcome back to Crosstalk.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Just before we get into this main topic of Enda today, Matt, yesterday the United States Senate was successful in obtaining the necessary 60 votes to stop a filibuster and invoke a cloture to advance the nomination of Andrew Hurwitz, known as the architect of Roe v. Wade, advancing him to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. All Democrats except one, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, voted to advance the nomination. All Republicans but 8 voted to block the nominee. The 8 who voted to advance this pro-abortion nominee were Senators McCain, Kyle, Alexander, Brown, Snow, Collins, Lugar, and Murkowski. So the pro-abortion nominee moves forward. Your response, Matt?
This is terrible. It really is an awful situation. He was actually put on the Arizona State Supreme Court by the very leftist Janet Napolitano. Of course, you know she's now in the Obama administration. And while she was there as governor of Arizona, she put him in this position. And while he was on the Arizona Supreme Court, he clearly disregarded following the Constitution. And in fact, Congressman Ted Poe has written a letter to the Senate Republicans urging them to oppose the nomination. And in that letter, he said, as a young law clerk, Mr. Hurwitz played a key role authoring Able and Able II, 2 1972 decisions, which are clearly reflected and expanded upon in the Supreme Court ruling on Roe v. Wade. He was clearly writing as the precursor of the liberal abortion decision of Roe v. Wade. He is clearly a judicial activist. We have too many of those activists already on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Unfortunately, the Senate filibuster did not get the required votes to stop the nomination, so it's going to go for a vote, and that's going to be coming up pretty soon.
Are you surprised by the 8 in the Republican side of the aisle who have in their party platform that of, upholding the sanctity of human life, that they would actually vote to confirm this man?
Very much surprised by that and very much disappointed, and certainly it underscores the fact that we need principled people in office at all levels that understand the role of the judiciary and understand, for example, if you're in the United States Senate, that you have an obligation not to just rubber stamp these radical Obama appointees that he's putting on the courts of appeal and district courts, but you have an obligation to put people on the court who understand their role as judges, as umpires, not activists.
And this Ninth Circuit is rather notorious for their very liberal-leaning decisions.
It is, and in fact, I was in Israel just recently, and I met with an Israeli Supreme Court justice, and they have the same problem there with judicial activism. And in fact, the justice had indicated that what has happened is that they look at what they call the penumbra that comes out of the constitutions or their laws, and in fact, that they actually take a very activist role at the Israeli Supreme Court. And they look to the United States Supreme Court as an example. Well, the penumbras came out of these contraception and abortion decisions that ultimately said that they can't find it in the Constitution, so they're going to look at the afterglow, the outer glow, around the edges of the Constitution. If it's not there, you can't invent it, but that's what some of these judges do. And when they do it here in this country, it ultimately has a terrible example for other countries around the world. And I could see it just a few weeks ago manifested at the Israeli Supreme Court.
Wow. Well, Matt, this morning, the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, or the HELP Committee, and after hearing testimony, this committee does need help, they held a hearing on S-811, Senate Bill 811. It's known as Enda, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act of 2011. What is your concern? You've sent out warnings regarding Enda. What is your concern regarding this legislation?
Well, Enda is the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and it would add to the existing non-discrimination categories, such as race and so forth, these new categories, and it would include, quote, sexual orientation and gender identity. And Enda applies to an individual's actual or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity. Gender identity is defined under this law as the gender-related identity, appearance, or mannerisms, or other gender-related characteristics of an individual, with or without regard to the individual's designated sex at birth. So, in other words, irrespective of whether you're clearly male or clearly female, if you want to identify yourself either in your thought or in your mannerisms as someone of the opposite sex, or even if you're not and somebody thinks you are, trying to identify yourself in a different way than you are at your birth sex, then Enda comes into existence. Now, put that into the context of race discrimination. With race discrimination, for example, you know someone is of a certain race or a different race. And it's clearer if you're making decisions based upon the fact that you don't want to hire someone because of the skin color. In that particular situation, the non-discrimination law is easier to apply, obviously. Here, when it's this amorphous moving target, and it is only what's in your mind, or only what's in the mind of the person who is your supervisor, then it is a completely moving target, and it ultimately does not allow for any clear enforcement. So what this ultimately does would be is that it puts these workplaces, and that it ultimately has a collision with religious liberty, because men can demand that they want to use the women's restrooms. And if you simply say, I'm sorry, this is only for the women, the men's restroom is down the hallway, that alone can be a discriminatory treatment. That alone can ultimately categorize someone based upon their gender identity, and that is a violation of Enda. So you can just imagine the absurd things that will come out of Enda, whether it's someone in a department store trying to tell people that you can only use one gender restroom or a restroom or a shower facility or a locker facility. The problems that will ultimately arise under Enda are just unbelievable.
This committee hearing this morning had 5 people that were slated to testify, including one named Kyler Broadus, whom the chair of the committee, Tom Harkin of Iowa, touted as being the first transgender to testify before Congress. But of the 5 people invited to testify, 4 of them were selected to testify in favor of the legislation, just one in opposition. That was Craig Parshall, Senior Vice President and General Counsel for National Religious Broadcasters. Matt, does it surprise you that the deck was so stacked in favor of the legislation?
No, it doesn't surprise me, because this is being pushed forward by just radically ideologically driven people in the Senate, particularly on one side of the aisle. And so that's what they're doing. They're bringing in these individuals to stack the deck. It's not a fair hearing. It's not a fair representation of what is the problem with this particular law. I was on a radio program, not regarding Enda, but regarding a locale that was going to try to consider a similar local law to Enda with gender identity. And the host was asking the other individual, who was a transsexual, and a transsexual is someone who is indisputably male or female, biologically and otherwise is male, but then wants to go through surgery to become or to look like the opposite sex. And that's what this person was. And the question was asked, isn't this forcing these radical views on people of faith and others who simply don't want to have this forced on them? And this person said, no, it's the people who are those of faith that won't accept this. That's the problem. The problem is not with a man that wants to use a women's restroom. The problem is with those that don't want the men to go in and use the women's restroom or changing room. And so it really switches everything on its head. And Enda will now, if it's passed, force every employer that has 15 or more employees to literally be very hostile environments of indoctrination for a radical sexual anarchist agenda.
And in the past, we saw Enda just with a sexual orientation component to it. But as you pointed out, this one now includes gender identity. And with the first transgender now testifying before Congress, this change that they're giving to Enda is a rather significant change, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, you first had sexual orientation. There was even a problem trying to figure out what that term means. But then they've gone to perceived sexual orientation. Now they've gone to perceived or actual sexual orientation or gender identity. And gender identity is simply what's in your mind from day to day. So it can be a fluid concept. And how is anyone going to know what's in your mind? So, for example, you have a man who innocently goes to use the women's restroom. That man is a man, thinks he's a man, wants to be a man. If you say, I'm sorry, that's the women's restroom, there's the men's restroom, and they say, oh, thank you very much, and they go down to the men's restroom. The next man comes along, and you say the same thing, I'm sorry, this is the women's restroom, you need to go down to the men's restroom. You don't know what's in that person's mind. Mm-hmm. They don't have to look like they are in drag. They don't have to look like they're a woman. They can simply be wanting to manifest themselves or have their identity associated as a female. And if you say the same thing to that person can say, how dare you segregate me like that? You are discriminating against me based upon my gender identity, and therefore have a lawsuit of discrimination against you as the employer or anyone else that is potentially a supervisor in that situation.
Didn't we just see that happen with Macy's in their changing rooms?
Yeah, and here's what also happens with that in Macy's and these other places is you can have someone who wants to identify as a female, and that's what they want to be in their mind, and they want to go into the women's restroom. And then you can have someone else who does not want to identify as a female, as an example. They really are comfortable with being a male. But they go into the women's restroom, not because they want to identify with being a female, but because they want to see females in a state of undress, or they may want to engage in some kind of sexual assault or worse even so, rape. And that's what you've seen happen in these places like these department stores around the country.
And, Matt, just a week or two ago, we received a letter from an inmate inside a correctional facility there on sex crimes-related issues who stated that would be the very purpose for those who have a mindset like he had, would be that to go in and do clandestine purposes, not identifying with a gender, but going in for clandestine purposes.
There's no question about that. They will absolutely do that. And if you want to say, hold on a minute, this is the wrong restroom, the one's down there, or this is the wrong changing room, now you will be sued. And that's what Enda does. It's just absolutely absurd, and it needs to be stopped.
Matt Staver is with us, the founder and president of Liberty Counsel, but Enda has a religious exemption. Does it hold up? We'll be right back to discuss that. You're listening to Crosstalk here on the VCY America Network.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, creation author and scientist with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, I've seen the photos of the skull bones of the extinct saber-toothed tiger. What kind of animal was that?
Chris, it's difficult to tell from a fossil just what the animal's life habits were. We do know that all cats are carnivores. The saber-tooth's long, curved teeth may not have been so good for fighting, however. Studies have shown that it would have been difficult for him to open his mouth wide enough to have a particularly strong bite. They now suggest that it killed by stabbing its victims with its teeth. Since it is extinct, we may never know. What we do know is that in the beginning, all animals were created to be vegetarian. When Adam rebelled, all of creation fell under the curse of sin, which is death. And soon some animals became carnivores, and then after the flood, many animals had to live by eating meat. Chris, this all happened back in Genesis.
For more on Genesis, visit our website at icr.org.
We're talking about Enda today here on Crosstalk with Matt Staver, the founder and president of Liberty Counsel, their website lc.org. And Matt, his testimony was held just a few hours ago in the Senate Committee on Health and Employment and Labor and so on. Attorney Craig Parshall was there, and he spoke in opposition to Enda, and he addressed specifically this so-called religious exemption. And this morning he said, this religion exemption really doesn't cut it. Tell us what your thoughts are on this religious exemption component. Will it offer protection to churches and religious groups that the proponents of the legislation say it will?
Well, under this particular Section 6, it says that it doesn't apply to a corporation, association, educational institution, or institution of learning or society that is exempt from the religious discrimination provisions of Title VII, which is the current employment discrimination provision. So on its face, it looks like, well, you've got this religious exemption, and that may or may not be true. The problem is that what you ultimately will find is that there are religious employers that may not fall under this Title VII exemption, but they run a business and they are people of Christian faith, for example, and their business doesn't qualify under Title VII.
It could be like a for-profit Christian radio station, a for-profit Christian bookstore?
Could be a for-profit, could be a not-for-profit. It could be something that wouldn't qualify there. You're exactly right. So that's going to apply to a lot of religious employers around the country. And then, of course, it's going to naturally apply to people of faith, Christians that are actually working in other businesses that are not religious. And so you are going to be, as an employee, and that's going to be, in addition to the impact that it's going to have on you as an employer, religious or otherwise, most of us are employees, and we're going to be going to work somewhere, and we're going to go to a workplace that has probably 15 or more people in it, and that is calculated in a way that you may be surprised at how many companies are actually covered. And they're going to go into that work environment, and if you are having a problem with the fact that the receptionist is dressing in a wild-looking drag outfit, or you're a woman and men come in and use the stall next to you, and you complain, who's going to be the one that's going to be targeted for ultimate punishment? It's not going to be the other person. It's going to be you, the bigot, the person who is now not falling in line with this sexual anarchist kind of mind-bending game. That's who's going to be the target. So you're going to go into a very hostile work environment. And this is going to create significant problems.
In regard to this religious exemption, the chair of the committee said that he wants to protect religious liberty, and you wait for that next word, but he reminded everyone that in 1964, he said the Civil Rights Act, which banned discrimination based upon the skin color of individuals, was said that it would violate religious rights. Is he talking apples to apples here between skin color and sexual preference?
He's not, but if, in fact, you put gender identity and sexual orientation into the same category as skin color, race, for example, then even though in reality it's not the same, it's worlds apart, how it will actually be under this law is it'll be treated exactly the same. So in the same way that the law applies to racial discrimination will be the same way it applies to this fluid gender identity provision. And even though it's going to be much more difficult to apply, it'll apply. So that's how ultimately you'll be treated. If, for example, you had a hatred towards blacks and you were promoting KKK ideas, in that way is the same way you will be looked at is if you had an opposition to homosexuality. You will be classified in the same category as someone who is a KKK kind of individual as it relates to people of skin color. And you, as the majority of Americans who believe in sexual natural relations, not this homosexuality, transsexuality, bisexuality, et cetera, you will be looked at as the bigot. You will be the KKK equivalent bigot as it relates to this issue, and you will be the ultimate target. And companies will be going overboard because they don't want to violate the law. So guess what they're going to be doing? Training programs. So you're going to be going through forced training programs, not to talk about non-discrimination, but to promote sexuality from a homosexual, lesbian, transsexual, cross-dressing, transvestite perspective.
Folks, just hours ago is when the committee came together. They heard testimony in regard to Enda. Again, the deck was stacked with those who are testifying on behalf of passing this legislation. Tom Harkins said that opponents just need to get over it. We need to move on. This discrimination is going on in the workplace. We need to pass this. We need to move on. Matt, the committee adjourned then this morning, stating that they would leave the record open for 10 days for any further submissions to the committee. Then they're going to come back and vote. From observation, it really seems like this is a sure thing that this committee is going to vote and pass this on to the full Senate. How critical is it, Matt, that our listeners contact their U.S. senators at this time pertaining to Enda?
I think it's absolutely critical. We cannot have this law passed. We just simply cannot have it passed. It will literally reshape America and business, and you will have your religious freedom on a collision course with this radical homosexual agenda. This will be the biggest club that the homosexual agenda will have to ultimately beat down people of faith and moral values. And in fact, there's already a person right now on the EEOC that's been appointed by President Barack Obama, Kai Feldblum. Kai Feldblum says that if there is a collision between the homosexual rights and religious freedom, guess which one wins? It is not religious freedom, it's the homosexual rights.
Wow.
And this individual is on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Guess what commission that is? Well, that is the commission that reviews this Title VII. This is part of where E.N.D.A is going to be, as part of Title VII, these non-discrimination provisions. Those complaints, when you file them, the EEOC gets involved, and Kai Feldblum is one of the most powerful people on the EEOC on the national level. So we already know that Kai Feldblum says homosexual rights win, religious freedom loses. We just had an opinion that came down from a New Mexico Court of Appeals within the last week, where there was a photographer, a wedding photographer, Elaine Photography. This company did not want to photograph and be part of a lesbian same-sex commitment in New Mexico, which bans same-sex marriage and defines marriage as only one man, one woman. But the law there also protects sexual orientation. And when they said no, the lesbians, instead of going to another photographer, filed a discrimination complaint. This photography company had to pay $7,000 in fines for not photographing this lesbian commitment service. They've gone through the appeal channel, and the New York Court of Appeals within the last week said that when these two rights collide, guess who they sided with? Homosexual rights, not religious freedom.
Wow.
If you put this now into the federal law, that will escalate it to a brand new level.
Folks, I checked out the bill today on the Senate's website. There are 41 co-sponsors, both sides of the aisle, on this Enda legislation. 41 co-sponsors is not, they've already lost a filibuster attempt with that. It is moving in the Senate. You can contact your senators at 202-224-3121. That's 202-224-3121. And Matt, if you were making that call right now, what would you say to your senator?
I would say don't vote or vote against E.N.D.A. and make sure that you not only, when it comes to you on the Senate floor, vote against it, but contact those that are on the committee and tell them to vote against E.N.D.A. This is critical. This is one of the most important votes that we're going to have in 2012. This is an absolute critical vote. 202-224-3121. Your senators will know it as E.N.D.A. or S-811. That's Senate Bill 811. On the House side, it's H.R. 1397. There's not any movement going on right now on the House side. Barney Frank is the author there, H.R. 1397. But
The House has 165 co-sponsors to it. Matt, while this is going on with the Enda legislation, there are some other significant matters going on related to the issue. One is Proposition 8 in California. What's happening there?
Well, Proposition 8, there's a couple of things that are happening, and Proposition 8 is one of those. First of all, on the West Coast and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decided they were not going to rehear en banc, or with the entire panel of the Ninth Circuit judges, the Proposition 8 case, which is the proposition that was passed in California that says marriage is between one man and one woman. And we know, for example, that there is a decision by a three-judge panel. Two of those three judges ultimately found that Proposition 8 was unconstitutional, which is a judicial activist decision. In fact, the individual who wrote the decision is the most liberal judge on the Ninth Circuit, and his wife works with the ACLU. His wife actually wrote a brief in the lower courts on behalf of the ACLU against Proposition 8. He actually wrote an article to a letter to the editor when Clinton was in office, complaining that Clinton was not appointing more homosexual judges to the bench. This is the guy who ultimately authored this decision. Now, where it goes after this is they will have an opportunity to file a petition to the United States Supreme Court. The review by the Supreme Court is discretionary, not mandatory. We don't know whether the Supreme Court will take the case. It's possible they will. It's possible they won't, in part because the way the decision is written, it was written so that it applies to California, but not much beyond California. On the other side of the coast, on the East Coast in Boston, the First Circuit Court of Appeals ultimately found that Section 3 of the Federal Defense of Marriage Act is unconstitutional. This is a case where some same-sex individuals that got a marriage license in Massachusetts filed suit against the federal government and said that the definition of marriage in the federal law between one man and one woman is unconstitutional, and therefore they should be able to get benefits from the federal government like Social Security and joint income tax returns. In other words, Massachusetts ought to be able to tell the federal government what kind of benefits it's going to give to Massachusetts, which is absolutely absurd. But believe it or not, the First Circuit Court of Appeals agreed, and they said Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act, which defines marriage as one man and one woman, is unconstitutional. Now, they struck down that section of DOMA. That will have an automatic review before the United States Supreme Court because it was a federal statute that was struck down, and that's not going to be one of those just simply discretionary reviews. It is going to the U.S. Supreme Court. Paul Clement is the attorney on that case. He's the attorney that argued the Obamacare case, and he's a great advocate, former Solicitor General, and he's a good person to have on that case. But in the next term, in the 2012-2013 Supreme Court term, the issue of the definition of marriage between one man and one woman will be before this United States Supreme Court.
Folks, much to be praying about, and we've got to be on our knees for this nation. We are going to open our phone lines right now, give you opportunity to call, to ask questions, to make comments pertaining to Enda or the DOMA legislation or Prop 8 and some related issues. Our number, 800-733-9829, 1-800-733-9829. Isn't it interesting that for close to 237 years as a nation, we've understood that marriage is between one man and one woman, and now all of a sudden we just aren't sure about that dictionary anymore. We'll be right back. You're listening to Crosstalk here on VCY America, 800-733-9829.
When it comes to the topic of origins, why shouldn't Christians accept millions of years? Couldn't God have used evolution? What about the gap theory? Could God really have created everything in 6 days? Cain's wife, who was she? Was there really a Noah's Ark and flood? Why does God's creation include death and suffering? Over 24 diverse questions are addressed in the New Answers book, Volume 1. As a matter of fact, Ken Ham, the editor of this book, said that next to the Bible, this New Answers book, Volume 1, is the most important book for people to read and understand on the topic of creation and origins. Leading apologists answer these questions biblically and logically in a simple-to-read format, including charts and diagrams. Copies of the New Answers book, Volume 1, are available from VCY for a donation of $18 or more by calling 1-800-729-9829. That's toll-free, 1-800-729-9829.
Folks, I hope you understand the ramifications of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, Enda. It's known in many communities as the bathroom bill. And yeah, it is taking place. It is taking place in communities, and now they're looking to do this on a federal basis. You know, all these special accommodations. I mean, we have even seen at one community that said, even in the pool shower houses, that people of a gender that were not assigned by birth, that they would have access. So if a man felt he was a woman or identified himself in such manner, that he would have access to the women's shower room at the pool facilities. And if people didn't like it, well, they could just wait and till he was done and then go use it. Matt, these are ramifications for businesses, ramifications for churches, for Christian ministries, for daycares. I mean, you name it, it would be all over the country.
No question. I mean, it has huge ramifications. And in fact, even if some organizations that may otherwise be exempt, they start to rent their facilities out to secular purposes, they may ultimately come under this particular provision. So all across the board, I think people of faith, whether they're employers or Christians that are in the workplace, they're going to ultimately be targeted, and this will be a huge hammer. This particular bill must not pass. I cannot overemphasize the importance of contacting your senators right now and asking them to stop this Enda bill, vote against it, and if they're not on this committee, contact those that they know on the committee to vote against it. And if it comes to the full Senate floor, they better ultimately vote against it. We will be watching them, and we will hold them accountable in November.
Folks, again, the Senate number is 202-224-3121. You can also go to Senate.gov. It's very easy to find the direct numbers to your two U.S. senators there as well. You can click on committees. You'll find all the names on the committee members as well. Just before we go to the phone lines, I want to quickly run a few things by you, Matt. First of all, you have made some pretty strong statements about Eric Holder, the U.S. Attorney General. Next week, the House Oversight and Reform Committee that's been investigating Fast and Furious. They're going to be holding a vote regarding contempt of Congress charges. The White House is standing by Eric Holder. What are your thoughts on this matter?
You know, I think this is the most politically motivated Attorney General that I've ever seen in my lifetime. The Attorney General of the United States is the highest law enforcement officer of the United States. You would expect, no matter whether they're Republican or Democrat, that they would have high integrity, that they would not pursue cases unless there are compelling facts and the law that ultimately compels the Attorney General to get behind a case and target the power of the United States government against an individual or a corporation. But this particular Attorney General has used this office for a very political, partisan, radical, ideological agenda. Whether he's running around the country finding innocent pro-lifers to file suits and say that they ought to pay $10,000 in damages for no reason at all, or whether he's doing the Fast and Furious situation or is responsible or turns the other eye on that particular program and then doesn't give the documents that Congress is asking. You go one after another after another. This is just a radical political agenda, and it should not be coming from the Attorney General. You might expect it from a president or for somebody else who's another elected official, but not from the nation's highest law enforcement officer. So I think I agree with John Cornyn that this Attorney General ought to step down and he ought to resign this position.
Wow. Well, we'll bring up some other issues as we go along, but our lines are packed. Let's begin in Hartford, Wisconsin. Phil, you're on the air.
Yeah, I've made some poor choices in my past. I've been to prison. I know people that would take advantage of this, and there's a number of people in prison that were caught for more serious crimes because of simply going into the locker rooms or whatnot. And once you open that door, now how many of those people would say, well, I felt like the other side, or I felt different than what you perceived. So yeah, this would be a huge danger. There's a huge population in prison that would use that as an excuse, a huge number of people who are pedophiles or whatever that would take advantage of this situation as an excuse to fulfill their fantasies.
Yeah, and for example, you go to a restroom, whether it's in a business or a department store or a changing room, say in a department store, they don't have age restrictions. They don't have girls under 12 in this restroom, women, of an older age in this restroom. So you can go into these restrooms or changing rooms if you're a man and want to go in and molest or watch or sexually assault young girls. The absurdity of this is just beyond understanding how someone could be in favor of it. This will ultimately, in addition to colliding with religious liberty, in addition to forcing a radical agenda on people, this also will put individuals at risk and ultimately result in significant damage and even death of some individuals.
Well, and the other question I have is, as far as these kids who grow up with a society that says, you know what, the rules don't matter, you can use any bathroom you want, what does that do to them as far as defining sexuality, defining the difference between a man and a woman, and how much confusion are they going to have with not knowing, okay, is it wrong or is it right for me to be comfortable in front, naked in front of a man or a woman?
Well, that's an excellent point. Say you have your 7-year-old young daughter, and you're the mother, and you're in there trying on a dress for her. And in comes a man, and he starts undressing there. What does that do to that young girl? That does cause gender confusion, and it does cause them to ultimately have some questioning and confusion. And that's exactly what this agenda is going to. Years ago, I said what the ultimate goal of this homosexual agenda is not this sexual orientation where you're wired to a particular way, but ultimately the abolition of gender. It's hard for us to even comprehend that. How can you abolish the concept or the construct of gender, male and female? It's so objective, it's so obvious. How can you do that? But that's exactly what they want to do. Anything that you see is just fictitious, but it's only what's in your mind. And if you abolish the concept of gender, you ultimately undermine morality. You ultimately have no morality and norms for men and women or sexual behavior. And as Alfred Kinsey ultimately wanted to do, he wanted to undermine morality in marriage. Why? So he could undermine the very concept of God himself.
Or as Tom Harkin says, well, just get over it and move on. Let's go to Cincinnati, Ohio. Greg, go ahead. You're on the air.
Yes, sir. I wonder if that would affect those people who are blind. I mean, I might be blind. I may not be able to see this stuff, but I can sure hear it.
Good point there, Greg. Yeah, thank you so much, Greg. Bob in Indiana, you're on the air.
Yes, I just can't imagine how absurd it is that we even have to be going through all this kind of discussion and votes and so forth. And I don't understand our Congress or House or senators or any of those people who could possibly think that this is the way to go. And please, folks, vote against it.
Bob, thank you for your call here today. And Matt, as we mentioned, right now with the number of co-signers that are on this thing, there's not even enough senators to hold up a filibuster at this point.
Yeah, you already said there's 40 co-sponsors.
41,
41 on the Senate side. So that's scary to see that there's that many people. There's 100 senators, and you need the 60 senators in order to ultimately have this filibuster. And right now, then we don't have it. So the problem is can we even filibuster this unless we get a couple of people to switch their votes? We're not going to have a filibuster, and this thing is going to go to the full Senate floor. And if it does that, I think it may pass by a slim margin, unless we get people on the phones and the phone lines are just melted down and they hear the outrage of their constituents and others around the country to simply say, we will hold you accountable This is not something that can just be taken lightly. You must vote no. This is non-negotiable. You must vote no on Enda.
By the way, folks, we've also just found a number directly to the committee. This is the committee that heard this morning, the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. The direct number to this committee is 202-224-5375. 202-224-5375. Let's go next to West Dallas. Brad, you're on the air.
Hi, Jim, Matt. This kind of thing is just another avenue for the God haters to go against God's created order and shake their fist in his face. This is always what it boils down to. And in this case, we have to remember that it's a direct result of elections. Elections have consequences, and the people who get elected appoint these people on these courts. And that's where all this drunken stupidity is coming from. And what I want to address here is that people who don't want to vote for someone because he's not just quite perfect, he may not be 110% pro-life, only 95, well, you've just allowed the guy that wants to kill every baby into office, and they end up appointing these judges, and this is where all this goofiness comes from. We have to vote as Christians. We have to vote as God would have us to vote. Vote for the best that's available. It's better than the alternative.
I agree with you. The elections have consequences, and what we have here is a group of people who ultimately were elected and became the most pro-abortion, pro-homosexual Senate in the history of America. And so that's why we've had all these things coming at us at rapid speed, and now we have Enda. We've got opportunities to vote our values this coming November, and that's what we ought to do. In the meantime, what we've got to do is hold these people accountable. We've got to stop this provision, and we've got to clean house and put people in office who will do the right thing.
True.
Thank you, Brad. Appreciate your call.
Thank you.
To Jean, go ahead. You're on the air.
Yes. I wish I had known about this more before our local Walmart tore down their old building and put up a brand new one. What kind of pressure? The public can do all kinds of things. We don't need big locker rooms in our high schools or colleges either for athletics. There should be all one-person dressing rooms or toilet rooms. All. We can get after the architects that design all of this.
Yeah. Thank you, Gene. Matt, let me have you address this because I believe it's in the state of Massachusetts where there was a school-aged child that believed that they were the opposite gender of what they really were. The school provided special accommodations for a unisex restroom, but this didn't satisfy them.
No.
And they actually sued so that they could actually use the restroom of the opposite gender.
That's right. In fact, that's not the only case like that, but there are some where you have the male and female restroom, and so you have the situation whether it's a younger child or an older adult that wants to use the opposite sex restroom, and obviously women don't want men coming into the restroom. They just simply don't. Obviously, that's common sense. So in order to say, well, let's just come up with something neutral. Let's have a third restroom, a gender-neutral restroom, or a gender-neutral, if you will, dressing room, where you can only use it one at a time. That doesn't satisfy them. Why? Because they want to identify as the opposite sex. So they want to be treated by the same standards as the opposite sex. And that may change from day to day. So this is a real problem that's going to be all across the country.
Thank you, Gene. We've got to take a break here. Matt Staver is our guest from Liberty Counsel, lc.org. We'll be back in 1 minute.
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House. Our website is worldviewweekend.com. Today we look at number 13 on our list of 20 characteristics of false teachers. Number 13, false teachers embrace moralizing. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 20 through 22 speaks to this. For if after they've escaped the pollutions of the world, meaning moralizing, they've cleaned up their life in some man-centered way, not through faith and repentance in Christ, but they've cleaned up their life through a self-help type program, man-centered works, then what happens? They return right to their sin, just as a sow having washed to her wallowing in the mire. In other words, these false teachers may be about trying to proclaim good works and good things, but they themselves are lost. They've cleaned up their life through man-centered efforts, not through faith and repentance in Christ. And so the end result for these false teachers is, after they're moralizing, they return to their sin. I'm Brandon House.
We're talking today with Matt Staver at Liberty Counsel. Let me just take a side note here for a moment. Matt, we are waiting right now upon the U.S. Supreme Court decision here on the Obamacare. Any indication when that decision is going to come forth?
I'm predicting that'll be the last week of June. It's possible it would be next week, but I suspect that, cases of this magnitude typically are the last week and most likely the last day of the session. And sometimes as they get towards that last week of June, they may add another opinion day. But their opinions usually come out at 10 o'clock on Monday, but they will probably add some additional opinion days. As we get closer to the middle to end of next week, if the decision has not come down yet, we'll be able to pretty well predict what day it'll come down with some fairly good accuracy. But it's going to be within the next 2.5 weeks, no question. It'll come down. It's going to be a big decision. And I'm praying that it ultimately not only strikes down the individual mandate, but ultimately guts the entire law.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to Enda. We have Dan calling from Wisconsin. You're on the air, Dan.
Yeah, my question is, as a father of 3 young children, I have 2 boys and a girl, and I'm happily married. How will this affect me, and like when I take my daughter out for lunch or something, or maybe take her out to buy a new dress, and all of a sudden I hear a scream and find out that there's, a man in there harassing my daughter. If I were to go in there and get involved with the situation, would that come against me for?
It could, and here's how you have to think about it, because this is how it actually apply. What happens if you're to a restaurant and your daughter goes and uses the restroom? And in the restroom, she's there, and your daughter is Caucasian, and say there's a black female there, as example. And she doesn't like people of black color. Now, I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm just saying hypothetically, okay? And she screams and says, I don't want to be around somebody of race. And you go in there and you protest and so forth. Well, the same kind of thing that would happen to you in that situation is the same kind of thing that would happen to you if, take the same situation, your daughter now goes to the women's restroom to use the restroom. You hear her scream. You go running by there, and you open the door, and here's a man undressed in the restroom, in the women's restroom. And you protest, and you yell, and you try to protect your daughter and comfort your daughter. Guess who's going to be the target? Not the man who's got his pants down in the women's restroom, but you, the bigot, the person who is violating the law. And if the owner of the restaurant or supervisor of the restaurant comes there and says, you can't do that, you've got to get out of that restroom, you're exposing yourself to these girls, guess who's going to be the target of a discrimination suit? It's the restaurant, not the pedophile or the voyeur man that's in this woman's restroom. That's the problem with this. And as absurd as it sounds, and it is absolutely absurd, it's hard to actually get your mind around this because it's just so ridiculous. That's exactly what E.N.D.A. will do. It will put all of these kinds of absolutely ridiculous things into a virtual reality.
There you go, Dan. Appreciate your call, and may not like the answer, but that's what's coming with E.N.D.A. Let's go next to Bosca Bell. Nathaniel, you're on the air.
Hi. I have a question. Under this new bill they're trying to put through, would it be possible for a convicted sex offender to demand to go to a women's prison?
Good question, and I think the answer to that would be yes.
It's just a matter of time.
Yes. Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes. If you can't segregate them because of their gender, you can't have men and women unless somebody wants to go to the other one, then yeah, it's going to apply in all of these different areas. And as absurd as it sounds, it'll apply. It'll eventually apply if you have situations in school, and you want, and the women want to be on the, or the men, take it from the men's side, want to be on the girls' soccer club and go in the same showers and shower with them.
Wow. Broad implications, folks. I'll give you numbers again in just a moment. We're going to pick up one final call from Wanakee. Joanne, you're on the air.
Hi, I just wanted to let you know I just called my senators, Cole and Johnson, and I've got numbers if somebody lives in the Madison area.
Yeah, Joanne, because we have people in states all across the country, I won't have you give individual senators' numbers, but our listeners can get them at senate.gov for their own 2 U.S. senators.
Okay. All right, because I just was going to say give their numbers. So.
Well, thank you for calling, too, and keep that up. And have your friends call as well. Tell people at your church this Sunday to make sure that they call.
Thank you so much, Joanne. We have people in all different states that are listening in right now. So if you'd like those individual numbers, rather than go through 100 senators, just go to senate.gov, and you can find very easily with your state the 2 U.S. senators there to represent you. In addition to that, you can call the members of the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions at this number, 202-224-5375. That's 202-224-5375. The Senate switchboard is 202-224-3121. That's 224-3121. Now, Matt, I'm looking at your website right now. I see your top article is called Enda, Another Radical Agenda Coming from a Dysfunctional Senate. How can our listeners get a hold of that?
They can go to our website, which is lc.org. That's just 2 letters, lc.org. And you can sign up for the Liberty Alert, which is free, and it's an email that keeps you up to date with issues such as this. lc.org is the place to go.
And for those who have other issues that come up on First Amendment-related issues, you have a toll-free number there as well?
We do. It's 800-671-1776. Just remember 671, and you've got it. 800-671-1776. And all that we do at no cost, so don't worry about giving us a call, whether it's a telephone call, a letter, a brochure, or representing you in court. We do that pro bono. So you can go to either lc.org or call 800-671-1776.
And you believe that action is imperative on this Enda legislation?
It's critical. I mean, I can't even really begin to underestimate what this means or will mean to America and to our values and to liberty and to just our security and safety if this particular bill passes. I think it's critical that people call and call frequently.
Matt Staver has been our guest today, founder and president of Liberty Counsel. Matt, thanks for being with us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Matt Staver with us, lc.org. You can check out more information there about Enda right on their website. But, folks, the Senate committee is taking about 10 days for further documents coming to them, and then they're going to be poised to come together and vote. Thanks for joining us today here on Crosstalk. Share this information with another through crosstalkamerica.com.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the Internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208. Or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.